Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is, thank you for the call and response team. It is Tuesday, April 7th, 1:15. We are continuing our work on H 955. And we are going to start by reviewing some updates to language on the property tax classifications with Kirby Heaton. And then we're going to go to a miscellaneous array of language with West State J. Kirby. And we received a bunch of like really technical edits from the tax department. And so Kirby made those, and that's what we're going to look at.
Good afternoon, ladies and gents.
Hello, Kirby.
Kirby Keaton, Legislative Council. So as the chair mentioned, there are some tweaks of the language. Since you saw it last, we received some more feedback from the department oriented towards, we're all evolving and seeing how this will play out in the real world. And they, got thinking and had some feedback. And then there's also some stuff in here I'll cover relating to some questions that I have that were raised partly out of discussion in committee. And then not sure if the chair wants to, but we could start talking about effective dates, or we can wait and talk about
effective dates when everything's all together and like see it all as one fell timeline.
So what we're looking at is a different document. You'll see it starts with section 57. That's your foreshadowing of a very large amendment coming. But I've pulled out just the classification stuff to talk about, right? So we start with the grand list. And we start with using the word dwelling units. There's two changes here. One was there was a reference to guidance from the commissioner here that the department wanted removed. It's implied that there'll be guidance for assessing officials, so it's not legally mandatory. So they wanted the as defined reference to refer to just the classifications definitions. So we made that change. But we have also, since the word dwelling units here, I'll jump right into that. The department pointed out how in the homestead chapter with homesteads, we're dealing with the word dwellings. And here we're also dealing with dwelling in the class, what would be the subchapter on classifications, but they have different meanings. The biggest difference in the meaning is that with a homestead, the dwelling does not have to be usable year round, but because of the definitional changes that have been made for classification purposes, a dwelling in that context would need to be used year round if it's, or habitable year round if it's to be considered a dwelling. So to avoid confusion between dwelling homestead, dwelling classifications, they suggested a few different things. What we've landed on for this language is having a difference between the two by having just different terms. So classifications would use the term dwelling units, which would have a different definition. These are all within their own chapters, and the definitions are supposed to be used within that chapter legally, but there could still be confusion of using one definition out of one chapter for a different chapter. So the hope is that using the term dwelling units for classifications is enough to distinguish it. Also, I'll just jump right ahead. You'll see language in here where we change the homestead language, where we also make it clear there that for purposes of the homestead and the homestead declaration, a dwelling does not have to be habitable year round. So we've there's a lot of belt and suspenders in what we're going to be looking at as far as covering our bases on both sides for both chapters. So there's dwelling units. Next change is also on the first page here for section 58, starting at line 12, where there was some language from where the framework for developing classifications was first drafted last session. And that language for the establishment of the property tax classification system had existed more or less unchanged since last year. And at that time, it was kind of envisioned that a lot of this would operate through the grand list. after the Act 73 report from the department and then through committee work, this whole process has drifted less about being about assessment and the grand list and more about the attestation that will be filed with the Department of Taxes, and the program will be, or the classification system will be run through that attestation for the most part. So given that the language that used to be here about having this information on the grand list, about having a property's classification being required to be put on the grand list, that's been removed because that's really not a necessary part of the system. And we haven't heard that there's a need for that information to be on the grand list. So instead of having that happen at all, the language has just been changed to remove it. So now the language says, for the establishment of tax classifications, each parcel of real estate shall be classified as one or more of the classifications listed under subsection B of this section, and based on information and guidance provided by the Commissioner of Taxes under this section and rules adopted under the Homestead Declaration section. So this is an establishment provision that does not require the classification to be put on the grand list. This is basically the gist of what this change is.
Want to deal with questions now or later?
Now it's good.
So is this state law that we're looking at?
This is the proposed state law. This is what the bill would make state law for tax classifications.
So I'm wondering why you removed it, why it doesn't show with the line through it?
Because it's not current law is why it doesn't have the strike through. If we're changing current law, that's where you see strike throughs. It's when we have a version of proposed language and then that gets changed, the strike, it would just be new language because it was never a law in the first place.
So we took out proposed language and we inserted new proposed.
And yeah, so when it comes to like Ledge Council walking through things, that's why we have to use highlights and things to show you there's changes, because it doesn't always show up in that case.
And these changes are, we had barely finished sort of our policy work on this language a month ago, some period of
It's
time.
been a while.
Oh, I have no idea if it was 5 years or 3 days, but and then the tax department took sort of another really deep dive on it and had some technical suggestions. And so these are being responsive to their technical suggestions.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Do you know, Kirby, why the tax department said that they don't need that classification on the grand list? Because I would think it would be something that would be important down the road to look at how many of those were.
I was of a similar thinking. I've been aware that that language has been unchanged as we've worked through it, and I never flagged it because I thought that there could be usefulness. But once they raised the question, we don't need it, and it would be extra work for assessing officials and then they'd have to work with the department. And so then the question of like, is this necessary? Unless someone has an idea in mind for what it could be used for, because the grand list is public information. So if it is on the grand list, it would mean that, annually your classification could change from year to year. But for any given year, a member of the public could look and see how a property is classified if they wanted to. Doing this, it means it won't be on the grand list, and it's more like the confidential, protected tax information, like when you file your income taxes. It would be more like that kind of data now, by not having it on the grand list in public like that. So there is like a real world difference between these things. But the question is like, do you want it public for a reason? Would the legislature want it public for a reason?
What I was thinking about is how homestead and non-homestead is, or even another example that I was thinking about is, some years the majority of my income is as an independent contractor, and some years the majority of my income is as a W-2 employee. And like that isn't public information. That's something that sort of changes every year and the tax department is tracking, but I don't have the public able to sort of track about me. Well, actually, I guess we do have those financial disclosure forms, but I mean, just like as a regular person.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, somebody could go in and grab the booklet of tax bills, and they could look at whether or not somebody paid his homestead,
Yeah.
non-homestead, or now
Yeah.
homestead residential.
Yeah, you're right. There's ways to get the information if you really want to look for it. So it's not really about that. I think it is about, this is work that doesn't need to happen, and being at the agency, having to do part of the work. makes sense for them to say why.
Okay. Thanks.
Still have the, what, 15 or 18 property classifications at the lister level?
There's quite a few.
Yeah.
You mean like commercial, industrial,
Right.
residential,
Residential less than 6 acre area.
And those are not the same as this, though. I don't want anyone to be confused
Totally
about that.
different, right?
Yeah, for different
Yeah.
purposes. One bit of feedback was, we didn't reference the commissioner of taxes without including that in the definitions. This is sort of legally optional because there is a provision in Title 32 already covering this, but threw it in there. They brought it up, threw it in there. Commissioner means commissioner of taxes. Subdivision 2, so that means the subdivisions were renumbered, by the way, just as a flag for you there. 1 became 2. Dwelling was changed to dwelling unit. We talked about that. And then I flagged for all the places where dwelling unit is used.
We may have covered this, but ADU then is a dwelling. If it's within it. Yeah, something like that.
An ADU could be a dwelling unit.
Could be, yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Depending on how it's welded.
That's helpful.
sure.
We shall not dwell on that. That was Bill. I just repeated it for the record.
Yeah.
Not a bad joke. Or a good joke, as the case may be. Sorry.
Right.
All right. Again, not dwelling, and we're moving on. At the bottom of page 3 of this document, under the provisions relating to mixed use parcels, I flagged some language here that's so we changed a few things with mixed use parcels. The first thing is that originally there's provision stating that buildings shall be classified proportionally based on the percentage of finished floor space used. And we added a provision, this is the belt and suspenders thing from the homestead chapter. Improvements and structures on a homestead residential or a non-homestead residential parcel shall be classified as non-homestead residential unless for a business purpose. This is to say that, for the second home classification, which is the non-homestead residential, it's going to be treated like homesteads are done. And that's just the same concept. I think it's been imagined that same concept will be used for classifications, but tax had flagged to just go ahead and put it in there. Subdivision 2 here, underlying land. This is one that I'm flagging for based off the committee discussion. It said underlying land shall be classified proportionally based on the same percentage of finished floor space of the buildings. I think that there's room for ambiguity and for confusion later when it comes to mixed use parcels, we've covered the buildings and the floor space and we've covered the underlying land, but we haven't addressed structures or fixtures that don't have floor space but do have value. And this came actually out of Representative Ode asked a question that made me start thinking about how people might be confused by that when we're talking about just buildings and land. The department might come back with further thoughts on this. I haven't had a chance to catch up with them to actually speak about it, but I think that we see things a little differently on this at the moment. But just as a placeholder, at least, that's in there to say that the underlying land, including improvements or fixtures that lack floor space, shall be classified proportionately. So that's a way to resolve when you've got, I don't know, a pool or a giant golden statue or something like that, and then someone saying, well, this isn't a building and it's not land. So how are you going to put the second home rate on my giant golden statue like that? I don't know if that would actually come up, but I think that's the point. There's things that could happen that we're not foreseeing. And so it's good to think about that and to at least have some provision to try to resolve these ambiguities. Again, like the department might have another solution for that. But I thought to at least put it in with the underlying land to settle it that way is a way to go. Subdivision 3 here says notwithstanding any provision of this subsection to the contrary, the entire parcel land surrounding a homestead shall be classified as homestead in accordance with subdivision 54017. That's part of the definition of homestead of this title. And then we've added including any improvements or structures considered part of a homestead under subdivision 7F of the definition of homestead. This is the belt and suspenders to make sure that everything that we're saying when it comes to the mixed use and how this committee's discussed how it's envisioned to work out for classifications aligns with what's said in homestead. So this is just a clarifying provision that in numerous places, we're basically saying that nothing that classifications definitions are doing is meant to change any definitions when it comes to homestead and how that treatment works. And this is one of those. Subdivision 4, if a portion of floor space is used for more than one purpose, the use for which the floor space is most often used shall be considered the primary use, and the floor space shall be dedicated to that use for purposes of the tax classification, except as provided for in the provision of the homestead definition that says if you rent out part of your homestead, that has to be considered a business purpose. So this is belt and suspenders. We're just saying except as provided for in the scenario that's already covered under the homestead definition. The next is the language relating to appeals. Originally, or all along, kind of for a while, the vision was that appeals would be handled like property valuation appeals are handled. And the department has pointed out, well, now that we've gotten into the dwelling use attestation and a reliance on that for so much of this, the dwelling use attestation is more like the homestead and it's going to be administered like the homestead. And when it comes to people having issues with the commissioner making a decision relating to their homestead declaration, those appeals are done to the department, not through property valuation process. And so that's true. And other things could come up too, other types of appeals that are decisions made by the commissioner. There's different ways of going about this, and this is an area that is going to require some more thinking about, more working on. I think the department is currently thinking about this topic. So what I've got here right now is basically making the appeals process based on the decision maker. If you're appealing a decision of an assessing official, you appeal it like property valuation appeal. If you're appealing a decision of the commissioner, then you appeal it like you would income tax appeals, which the reason why that's referenced is because that's what's referenced for homestead, is why that appeal process is chosen here. And then just one thing that would come up was if a person files an appeal with the wrong entity, because we do have two choices here, then that appeal will be considered timely, and then it would be forwarded to the correct entity. That's what we have now. There's, I don't know the department's comfort with this, but I'm thinking that they're going to come back with more on this, so that you know. Looking further down on page 7, this is adding language for the dwelling use attestation that it has the same deadline as the October 15 deadline for homestead declarations. And I'm going to flag a couple of other things that are not here, but that the department has raised, but they were policy issues and just didn't have the ability to go into, but just so that you're aware. And I don't know whether they're going to want to come in and talk to you about it or not, but they did raise one issue, which was whether any of this should allow municipal abasement of hardship arising from dwelling use attestations and the classification system. There is a hardship process relating to homestead declaration filings. But since that would require some policy decisions and some possibly some significant statutory changes. It's not there. That's something they flagged. Another thing they flagged is,
Sorry, the hardship for homestead, it's a hardship for not having like a hardship that resulted from not having filed the homestead, not a hardship from having to pay homestead taxes, right?
definitely not that,
Okay,
but, yes.
I think that's a fair thing to add, I think consistent. Yeah. I think this is a new form and it's gonna be, anything new takes a while to adjust to and not too much.
So do you want me to work that in?
That makes sense to me. I don't,
Yeah, just for the point of that, on the hardship for owing property taxes. Boards of abatement can abate taxes. If someone falls behind for. You have a heart attack, you're in the hospital, you don't work for 3 months, or so just.
yes.
Might be a distinction without a difference, but
Well, I'm
there
talking
is a
about-
way for,
Yes.
I think in this case, though, it's a slightly different process
yeah,
than that, because there's a specific homestead.
right.
So
I'm talking about, so in this context, we're talking about a hardship about filing or not filing the paperwork, not hardship related to the
Okay.
need to pay the taxes.
Yeah.
So we're not changing the hardship for the need to pay taxes. That has its own system. But using the existing hardship for filing paperwork or not filing the paperwork, extending it to all the paperwork makes sense to me personally.
And
Anyone else have any?
I can walk through hardship because I did actually include that language in case you wanted to talk about this topic. Because it's not being changed at this point, but so for the homestead declaration, hardship means an owner's inability to pay as certified by the Commissioner of Taxes in the Commissioner's discretion, or means an owner filing an incorrect or failing to file a correct homestead declaration due to one or more of the following: full-time military service, serious illness or disability, serious illness or death of an immediate family member, or disaster. So to basically allow the commissioner's hardship process to be done for dwelling use attestation filers.
Representative Maslin?
Yeah, and I agree. Thank you, but I recognize also, I think we do, that in some cases when we're increasing specificity with our language, some people are simply gonna be confused from time to time, and that's fine. So the language we have now, I think, allows, it provides allowance for that.
I'll get my homework, it's not a sufficient excuse.
So the other thing they brought up was,
Can I just mention, I always thought these 4 things were decided by the Board of Civil Authority. Somewhere along the way, got a hunch that not every town uses the Board of Civil Authority, but my town does, and they are the select board.
That process does exist. It still exists. And I think that's what Representative Lovsack was talking about, how there's that one I would say it's broader and there's more discretion for the town. But also, as we've discussed recently, the town has to pay the difference in ed tax currently if they abate that. This version of things is done through the Department of Taxes, and it's relating to these filings. It's not the same, but it's much more specific to specific issues that come up. And I think there's a history there because the legislature's become aware of some issues, especially relating to people who don't have a lot of income and don't know to file a homestead in order to save them this homestead declaration in order to save themselves some money. So some processes have been built over time for these situations.
Changing the old way?
We're not changing anything. What we're doing is expanding the current system. We're not changing the Board of Civil Authority at all. I'll be clear about that. We're expanding this Department of Taxes hardship process to also allow it for the classification systems. That's going to be new.
So the hardship process that's under the Department of Taxes, where does that meet what the Board of Civil Authority does, or are they the same?
They're not the same. They're different, and they're in different scenarios where they could come up.
Can I use an example?
Yeah.
Would that be helpful? So, if I had a tax bill like a legitimate tax bill from my town. And as Teddy said, I had a medical event and so I couldn't work. I could go to my Board of Civil Authority and I could say, can I have a payment plan? I have an economic hardship. That's for a bill that I am owed with no mistakes in the bill.
Uh-huh.
If I am a person who does not file my taxes regularly because I don't have an income, I might not realize that I need to file a homestead form. And my not filing of homes, I might not realize, like I might get my property tax bill and I might not look at it very closely because it's an escrow, and then like months go on and I miss the deadline of having to fix the paperwork. And then I'm like, oh my God, my tax bill is way higher than it should be because I didn't file my homestead declaration. I could be in touch with the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate and say, I didn't file this paperwork and it's a real economic hardship for me that I didn't file this paperwork. And the Department of Taxes could say, yes, that's an economic hardship. You can fix your paperwork even though you're past the deadline.
And the Board of Civil Authority couldn't do that?
No, because they're about saying whether or not you owe taxes to the town, not about sort of your status for your taxes. And that's current law.
Thank you.
Okay.
And so as we're adding a new piece of paperwork, we're just treating it the same way we treat the other piece of paperwork.
The other issue that they brought up has to do with, like, there is the question of currently we're the way that this language approaches dwelling use attestations is that a homeowner or a property owner will have to file either a homestead declaration or a dwelling use attestation every time. It's like one or the other will be relevant. So the department raised the question of, well, what if you just made non-homestead residential a default so that if you don't file, then that's the classification you're given, and then that would cut out a lot of the paperwork, is I think like the question. And it's a fine point, but it's also a policy thing. So we could change the language. What it would mean is that currently we have penalties for non-filing and failure to file when it comes to non-homestead residential. We would take that language out because it wouldn't be necessary. We would change it so that that there's just a default classification if there's no dwelling use attestation.
You're asking us if we wanted.
That's the point. And I guess if you the counterpoint would be you would have a situation similar to what we have with homestead where there's failure to file, which is detrimental to the taxpayer, but it had to do with like a lack of knowledge or savviness on their part, and they end up paying more. But that could happen even with what we have written here as well.
I've been spending the last 20 years trying to get the people in my district to file, regardless of what they earned, to always file an income tax because it almost always affects their property tax. So I'm going to try to get them to file, to be out in the open and, to look at it. And then we can all say, look, you could get a cheaper rate or you could get reimbursement or something. So now is that going to be gone?
I think that's what sorry.
Right.
I mean, what I like about, if I'm understanding this right, what I like about this is it's treated very similarly to how the homestead declaration is treated. And so from my perspective, if more people are filing this paperwork, we're better normalizing the filing of this paperwork. And that might mean that more people are likely to actually file it even when it's in their best interest. So maybe I'm misunderstanding this language.
I guess one way to put it in the context, if you're thinking about homesteads like that, is making the change that they're suggesting would make it like homestead in that if you don't file, you end up actually. The way it was imagined when homestead was made is if you don't file, you end up paying a higher rate, but as we know, that's not always the case. For this, we think it would be the case because the expectation is that the tax rate multipliers that will be applied to non-homestead residential properties will definitely result in a higher tax bill. So it would be like homestead in that the non-filers should be treated similarly. I think what the chair was getting at was to get at the problem you were raising with people aren't always aware that they need to do this thing and that it could negatively impact them. That maybe there's going to be more awareness of filings that need to be done because dwelling use attestations will be a filing and more taxpayers will have a filing requirement. And if you make it a filing requirement across the board for every property owner, maybe that will increase participation or
I
action.
thought it was already a requirement that everybody had to file.
You have to, if you have a homestead, you do have to file.
And some people don't because they
Yeah.
are in this funk, they feel like, no, I don't have to file, or they're not aware, or
Mhm.
something. I mean, I still do have probably a couple dozen people in my district who don't file
Mhm.
for all my efforts. But a lot of them do file.
And so nothing we're doing with classifications, unfortunately, is going to solve that problem. But it is analogous when you're thinking about, how much do you want classifications to work on that system? Or how much do you want them to work like a variation of that system?
And from your perspective, Kirby, does this seem consistent with that system?
If you make the change they're suggesting, it's consistent in that homesteads right now, if you do not file, then your property ends up being classified as non-homestead.
No.
Under this system, there will also be a classification that's default if you fail to file. What they're suggesting in some ways is taxpayer friendly in situations where you would have been classified as non-homestead residential, you didn't file. Well, the default's non-homestead residential, no harm, no foul. Under the language that we currently have proposed here, there's penalties. Although I think that we've changed it so that the penalties, we have to look at that again. There are no penalties if it's to your detriment.
So right now, businesses just don't file because they're not homesteads, so they don't file a form at all. So if we went to the system of just saying, if you don't file a dwelling use attestation, you end up as non-homestead residential, then you're throwing a bunch of businesses into that category that would otherwise be non-homestead, non-residential. Somebody's going to be affected by not filing a dwelling use attestation, so we just have to figure out.
And I think at some point in a conversation with Jake, and I'm sorry if I'm quoting him wrong, he was just he was playing out the scenario of, is the default state the most expensive state? And is that the incentive to do your paperwork? Or is the default state the most expensive state and that is not a fair system? Or do we create the default state something else in order to with the assumption that people?
I think under the language that you do have, I think what the point that they're raising is that I think they're thinking of it from a tax administration perspective. And when there is a non-filer, what did they do? Under the language here, there's penalties and such for filing correctly and incorrectly. And it's certainly inferred that the department will have to make a decision. And I think they're probably sitting there thinking, part of why they're proposing this maybe, obviously I'm not speaking for them, but being in that position where there's no filing and then they have to decide how a property is being used and how to classify it. So having a default takes the decision making for the department out of it. And if that's not the case, then what is going to happen? And is the department going to come back and say there's 10% of businesses are non-filers? So we're having to chase down and personally, check 10% of all businesses in the state. and we can't. Something like that could happen.
So Kirby, I guess you keep saying the department's the ones that are gonna have to consider this, but isn't it the listers that are gonna have to consider it first?
So under the system that we have and the words on the page now, the listers are only going to be checking to see how many dwelling units are in a building. That's all that's the only role they have at this point. The rest of it is basically on the property owner to give the rest of the information to the department each year. And then for the department to have to check for compliance and administer all that.
The same way we do homestead.
It's gonna be a major task on their part, if you ask me.
On whose part?
Department of Taxes.
I mean, it's the same, that's what we do for homestead and non-homestead right now.
Well, we have a role there as well, listers.
But is it an official role or an unofficial role?
Well, I mean, I treat it pretty officially. I mean, if I know somebody's, like you said, living there and having a
Yeah.
child, hello, hey. you know,
Yes.
I mean, anyway.
But is that your statutory role or is that something you do as sort of a person like,
It's just something to do.
yeah, yes. Yeah. And so I think the intent here is to not sort of increase the statutory role for listers. And knowing that like, right now, the tax department regularly talks to people in towns to check up on complaints just like that.
Still gonna make some sense. The tax department comes back and says, yeah, this person's either non-homestead residential or not.
I think one thing that's cool about this is that the tax department's also going to be able to cross-reference with income tax records to verify things in a way that a town official could not.
Are we saying that they have to do that or they?
No, they just, I mean, compliance is. And we try not to put too much compliance like into statute because the same, because they don't want the public to know their tricks. I don't know a better way of phrasing that.
The problem here, what's the problem we're trying to solve?
I think in the context of the tax classifications, we're trying to decide what we want the default, no paperwork has been filed status to be. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of all of it is, how do you go about that? If you keep the language as it is, it means that there will be a filing requirement for every property owner. And in the case of non-filers, the department will have to figure it out. And there's penalties for, obviously fraudulent filings, but also for filings where there was an error that's to the benefit of the, property owner.
Did you hear us say your name?
I know.
I heard some, that's why I came over.
But now the default is it goes to the abatement board and they might end up in a tax sale.
No,
If they're too total, Carolyn, I think it'd be helpful for you to, that's about sort of total tax liability. And if just like, let that all go, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, really. I mean, everything is deeply connected, but like the need to pay your full property tax and the abatement process for that is sort of outside of the scope of
I
this.
think
bill.
one thing, we're talking about really in the front end of deciding what a property tax bill is gonna look like. And what you're talking about, especially, like you're talking about the very end of the process where it's been due, it's overdue. So yeah, we're on different parts of the process. This is about, in the first place, deciding the classification, which then results to what tax rate will be applied. And then billing would happen after.
Yeah, I don't see where one stops and the other ends, but anyway, whatever.
Representative Burkhardt.
Yeah, I think, so is there a situation where a business would not be filing? Like business taxes? I'm just trying to think about like. Charlie, you're nodding your head, yes. Is there a situation where that would happen?
Yeah.
Okay,
You could be a renter and there could be an LLC that rents the property to the commercial business. So is the LLC in that mixed use property filing at attestation
But would that LLC file income taxes? Business taxes?
Yes.
Because that was my thought about,
That's just enclosed.
Well, let's let Representative Burkhardt finish her.
because my thought was trying to figure out like how to make the least amount of paperwork for everybody, right? And so if we defaulted to the highest rate, I was worried about harming businesses, right, who accidentally didn't file a form, but it's one thing to sort of tack on another form if you're filing your taxes. Because I think that's where a lot of homestead declarations get missed. It's folks who don't have to file income because they're just in a position of not needing to. And so they don't think, oh, I need to have a form filled out at the same time because they're not doing income tax. But businesses would be doing income tax every year anyway. It would be an additional form that they would need to fill out to make sure that they weren't falling into non-homestead residential. But I would think this category of non-homestead residential, a lot of those folks are probably not filing income tax in Vermont because their income tax is getting filed someplace else.
The department would absolutely be the best to speak on their ability to check on these things. I mean, I think you're onto something, but it's going to get into the weeds of how their returns and what they can access on their returns.
I think this is a good moment to ask Jake a question. Hi, Jake. Nice to see you. So we are going through sort of technical edits, suggestions from tax. And this language is definitely a policy decision, and we're assuming intent of the tax department, but maybe you could speak to the intent of the tax department. Basically of which status the default status is. If you don't file, to some degree, where are you?
Okay. Jake Feldman, Tax Department. If you are the owner of a dwelling unit that's fit for your own computation, the default status would be, the default tax classification would be non-homestead residential.
And if you had a business property that wasn't residential, how would we be sure that they would not fall into that category?
They would be just the non-homestead, non-residential or whatever it's called. And we would know that because they don't have a dwelling unit on the property. So there's no homestead declaration filed. So that is what it would have to be.
And you all would figure that out in your office, basically.
I mean, it would be. The listers would have to classify as they do now, but they would know. Okay, no dwelling unit here. And I don't have a homestead on it, so it's gotta be non-homestead, non-residential.
What about long-term rentals though?
If you are the owner of a long-term property with a dwelling unit that will be used as a long-term rental, you would want to file an attestation saying that that is how the unit is gonna be used. And then that information comes to the tax department, goes to the town, kind of like homesteads now. And then the town would classify
And I think,
that parcel.
and they're asking, what if that property owner was a non-filer though? Would the department be able to figure all that out?
Good question. So if right now, if you rent at least one unit, you are required to file the landlord certificate. Which is a retrospective thing about the prior year, who did you rent to? This is a new requirement that could be like appended to the landlord certificate saying, tell us about your units and how they will be used in the coming year. So hopefully they're filing already. So it's consistent. But if they fail to file, then it would be non-homestead residential.
Is that your take on the current language or I don't know if you missed the discussion, but it was, I mentioned that in an email from Abby that you were on, there were 2 policy suggestions on there, and I told them that we haven't changed that language yet, but I did mention that the department flagged these things. And one of the items was to make it expressly the default to go to be non-homestead residential. And then to do away with the consequences for being a non-filer because the default would be there.
That would be a preference. You don't need a penalty, I mean, assuming in the future state that the non-farm residential could be the highest rate. You don't need a penalty, and you want a situation where your run-of-the-mill second homeowner doesn't have to file anything. And so, yeah, you want the default to be the highest rate without a penalty.
And that's what this language does.
It does not expressly make that the default, and since that's not express, my read on it is that it leaves it to the department to do the compliance work that Jake was just describing partly there to figure it out. But if you want to make it a default, that would be a tool that they would have, would be a settled question. And that's what happens.
Okay, let's sit with this a little bit and keep on going through the bill.
So going back to the document here, page 9, we just have dwelling changed to dwelling unit in many places. For the transition language, which you recall the idea was to repeal everything from Act 73 related to classifications that were contingencies and transition provisions, and then to reinsert them. So not to remove them permanently, but just to reinsert those. And in some cases, the language has been updated through the committee process here. I've flagged the education reform timeline has shifted, and I don't currently know, and I'm not sure if it is currently known. So just trying to flag dates as we go. And as we start to work on all this with John and Beth too, there's going to be effective date questions that keep coming up. But so one thing that's flagged here is for the transition, is it for calendar year 2028 that the department starts setting this up? Or do we need to change that date to a different thing?
And let's leave all the dates to be figured out once we have all the dates in front of us.
So I'll just keep trying to continue to flag these things. And so this is the transition stuff. Right now it's 2028, may change. This is just the repeals from everything from Act 73. The idea is this is going to be effective on passage, and then all the replacement language will be effective on passage is the idea. So just more dates. There's some new language here. This is coming again from clarification for the department have pointed out. This is belt and suspender stuff, like I mentioned before, in the definition of a homestead. This is where we're putting in the language relating to dwelling used exclusively by the owner for domestic purposes as part of the homestead. That's the part of the classifications where we were dealing with the issue of a duplex in which a person uses the entire thing as their homestead, right? Current law doesn't directly address that. This would make it so that for homesteads, the current laws addresses it, and we're also addressing it for classifications. And this is also where we're adding to the homestead definition, the clarification, the belt and suspenders that a dwelling for purposes of a homestead does not have to be fit for year-round habitation. It's not going to change your classification, which we've got a lot of language at this point where I think it should be very clear that the classifications definitions should not affect anyone's eligibility for a homestead, or changing it from the current law treatment. I'm not going to go into effective dates yet because I'm thinking that that's going to be covered later when we're talking about the whole package. So that's classifications where we stand. I cited a couple of things that I anticipate the department will come back on. There's also a couple of things we brought up that are policy decisions for you. I was told to add the hardship, to address the hardship situation the next time, but that's where we are. And I'm done.
Anyone? Anything?
Hardship, what did you just say about?
The chair asked that we make the hardship process that we're talking about for that applies to homestead declarations and a failure to file those, that the Department of Taxes can use to make corrections in certain situations of hardship, that we allow that for dwelling use attestation filings also.
Okay, oh, okay.
And then the part that we still need to figure out is to get totally clear on this, the best language for this default state. That's.
There's the appeals language too, so I think the department's gonna have all stuff.
So I guess the thing that's bothering me about this whole new hardship thing is that I know of cases in small town Vermont where someone has been able to intervene on behalf of a property owner and somehow work
Mhm.
out a problem so that the taxes get paid to the happiness of the town and the person keeps their property. I'm worried that in this new thing now where the tax department is in charge, they don't know the people, they don't know the family, they don't know what other resources they've got to deal with. And the person ends up selling, being forced to sell or.
So, yeah, so under current law, when it comes to homesteads, if there's a mistake and a problem, a person can reach out to the department. Usually it's the taxpayer advocate. You remember like Jeff Dooley when he comes to the taxpayer advocate and he talks about people reaching out to him. And he frequently says like most of what I do has to do with the homestead. Like he said that, like this is what we're talking about. Basically expanding that. So if with this new system, with this new filing requirements for a dwelling use attestation, to let people do that too, to reach out to the department and get some help in certain situations when they've made a mistake with their filing of the dwelling use attestation. So I'm being asked to basically expand the options for taxpayers to reach out and get help with.
But we're not messing with the thing that the Board of Civil Authority does at all. We are
No.
not touching that.
Not taking away any options for people to help, to try to reach out and get help, just adding one. And to contextualize it, it's going to probably be businesses most of the time because of the context here.
I see that. I hadn't thought of the situation that Bridget brought up, but yeah, but the ones that I deal with, most of the time are mistakes on the part of the owner. He either doesn't file or forgot to file or something. But I know the family. I know to call the two daughters. They all band together to pay his taxes or something. It's knowing who's who in a small town that the tax department doesn't know. How
The tax department can help by like if the statute allows it, they can correct the filing so that the person isn't hit as hard and doesn't owe as much taxes. That's their part.
property tax?
Yes.
Well, I've never seen that happen.
They can't forgive what's owed, but they can try to make a correction to the filings under certain circumstances, I want to say. So that the bill effectively ends up going down because the property gets classified correctly. In this case, it will be that, hey, I have a business, we're getting hit with the second home tax rate. We need to get the business tax rate. And the department, if the statutory requirements are all met, could say, yes, this is creating a hardship for you. We will make the correction. Even though under the law, we don't have to make the correction because you missed your deadlines and you made some mistakes, but we can fix it because the statute allows it. Like that is what would happen under what I'm being asked to put in here.
So extenuating circumstances. So John and Susie are in a car accident. They both spent a month in the hospital. They missed their filing date. So suddenly their tax rate is higher. They're like, hey, we were in the hospital. We couldn't possibly fill this out. We were in a coma.
Yeah.
You got to give me the lower rate. And the tax department would probably say, well, that's too bad. You should have thought, no, they would say that's a hardship. And then you get the lower rate.
Another thing that's been happening, I've had people come to me and say this has been happening. Sometimes the tax filing software, if it's national tax filing software, doesn't pick up our homestead declaration.
Yes.
And so we actually in our house got a surprise bill last year that sort of said, this is a much higher bill. And we were like, whoa, that was not expected. And it was because the tax filing software that we use had not picked it up. And so then we had to go back through the process of making sure that that homestead declaration was filed. So it's not even like a severe hardship. It's just a mistake or a miss. And so I was trying to figure out, but if it's a different situation than if you're just not filing at all because you don't need to file income taxes to even know that you need to go and like file a form is a different thing.
Thanks, Kirby.
You're amazing, Kirby.
Decide by the end of this. Done that? That's done?
It's just me.
Okay.
Somebody, have dinner.
So Beth has a very miscellaneous collection of language that addresses a bunch of pieces that have been floating around. And they're all in one document because they'll have to be somewhere.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel.
Sorry, I have one more thing to say about them, Terry. And Sorcia is printing things for people, but tomorrow we're gonna look at the whole bill all together, so, you'll get new versions of everything tomorrow morning. Please plant a tree over the weekend. Back to you, Beth.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I will share my screen. A slight preview of what you'll see tomorrow in that this has already been formatted as a committee amendment to H 955. This has not been edited. I've seen typos. There are things not underlined that should be underlined. Too bad.
And folks, that means please don't point those out or correct them. It's not necessary.
Thank you. First instance of amendment. This is instances, not strike all.
Oh.
No. You guys gotta pay attention. Is to section 4 of the underlying bill of H 955 as introduced, which is the section that talks about the startup grants for CSAs. And all your amendment is doing is keeping everything that's already in there, striking out what was added as a subsection C and replacing it with new language. And this is just the appropriations piece. For adding money to the grant program. So the budget that left the House made some amendments to the Act 73 appropriations to AOE. And what this language in the first instance of amendment does is make it an allowable use of some of that money. It makes adding money to the CSA startup grant program an allowable use of some of that money, some of the Act 73 appropriations. So of the funds appropriated to AOE in 2025 Acts and Resolves number 73 in that section, as amended by section C103, and then fancy words that are referring to the budget without actually saying it's the budget. $30,000 shall be used to provide additional funding to the CSA startup grant program. And you're going to see this concept repeated in the next couple of amendments. So not making a new appropriation, making an appropriation that's traveling in the budget making this language an allowable use of that appropriation. Second instance of amendment, section 17 of H 955 as introduced is all of the appropriations for the study committee reimbursement grants, the Seesaw executive director grants, etc. We're going to strike that entire section and put in a new section 17 to do the following. The programmatic language remains the same. It's not highlighted. The yellow highlighting represents language that's different from the underlying bill. So AOE is still required to pay up to $10,000 to a study committee formed pursuant to section 13 of this act to reimburse participating school districts, yada, yada, yada. That language is all in H 955 as introduced. The only language your amendment is actually changing is the way the appropriation is formatted. So no longer is it a new appropriation. It is saying that the money needed to fund these grants is going to come out of the Act 73 appropriations that you've amended in the budget. So again, making an allowable use of an appropriation targeting. Subsection B, this concept is in section 950, is in Act 9, H 955 as introduced. We had to change the wording based on how the appropriation is going to be drafted. So of the funds appropriated to AOE in Act 73, amended by the budget, 442,000 shall be granted to the Vermont Learning Collaborative within 45 days of passage of this act for the purpose of hiring facilitators. And then VTLC is allowed to use up to 32,000 for administrative costs. Same concept, I'm on page 3, subsection C, the Seesaw Executive Director Grant Appropriation. Instead of a new standalone appropriation, we are saying that the Act 73 language that was amended in the budget, this is an allowable use of that money to fund the Seesaw Executive Director grants. And that is it for appropriations. Any questions before I keep going? Okay. This was complicated to work out, so I'm glad that we can move on. Very, very grateful to JFO for partnering on that language. Okay. Third instance of amendment is to the effective dates, the contingency language. So you're going to strike out what the bill does as it's introduced and replace it with a whole new section 18, which is amending the effective date section of Act 73. And this is where we add, we change some of the contingencies and we add some contingencies. We also push out the foundation formula from July 1, 2028 to July 1, 2030. Subsection E, section 61A, is Kirby still here? Can I phone a friend on what this does?
We're going to be removing that change to the effective dates because the language I just showed you repeals sections anywhere. We don't need to change those effective dates.
So subsection F.
We'll spend time on what that means once we have the whole thing together.
Subsection F is the contingencies for the foundation formula. So keeping what education did, pushing the foundation formula out from 2028 to 2030, and then amending the language slightly here to make it clear that this contingency, that votes have happened on proposals to form a unified union school district, this contingency is going to be met regardless of whether there's actually any votes that occur or not. So if votes do occur, they have to happen by November 7th, 2028 for the contingency to be met. But if no votes have occurred, as long as school districts have had an opportunity to study the advisability of forming a new unified school district, then subdivision A would be met. No change to subdivision B, no change to subdivision C, and no change to subdivision D. Subsection G is the same language I just went over. This is for a piece of the tuition statutes, had a slightly different contingencies. We're keeping most of those, but anything related to school district boundaries, that language is going to track the foundation formula contingency language, and so it's the same. And then there are no contingencies in subsection H, but we just didn't want to forget it. Fourth instance of amendment.
Wait, okay, so everyone, we're moving on to a whole new idea now. Closing up that idea. Okay.
Fourth instance of amendment. We're gonna strike out section 21, which is the pre-K report, and put in new language also for a pre-K report. So Building Bright Futures, in consultation with JFO, shall make recommendations regarding the appropriate funding level per pupil to provide a categorical grant sufficient to fund 10 hours of pre-K education in public and private settings, and the appropriate funding level per pupil to account for administrative costs at the school district of residence. And then keeping the language, the rest of the language the same.
And I think JFO still needs to do a little bit of work on this language with Building Bright Futures to figure out who and how is going to be responsible for what. So even if everyone, I encourage the committee to not get too attached to this language because we're going to have a recommendation to change it for the people who actually have to do work. Yes, Representative Bodie.
I appreciate that you're gonna make changes for the people who are gonna be doing work, but we've told them we want a categorical plan. And I don't, have we had this on yet?
We are not.
So I was not necessarily thinking I liked that idea.
Okay.
You know, so I just would like to, I mean, maybe we could have something that says this is what a categorical plan will look like, and this is how it would look if we weight them in the formula.
Mhm.
I don't want to have only one choice. in
Yeah.
front of me.
I'm full transparency. I am frustrated that we have been studying this problem for 5 years and we continue to, and like, that is not anyone's fault around this table and certainly not your fault, Representative Bodie. And it's not any of the staff's fault. And it's, and if just repeating frankly, the exact same study language that we had last year, it seems like we're going to wind up in the exact same situation we were in this year. And so in an effort to move things together, I think there are implications to using the foundation formula in this context. They're very outside of this committee's jurisdiction.
How so? I mean, I just don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
You're saying
I know.
that,
Yes,
but
yeah,
how-
yeah, yes, yeah, I appreciate
need to
that.
understand.
Okay. So we will keep this open and keep on talking about it. Representative Holcomb?
Yeah, I have similar concerns. I mean, I think we've literally studied this 10 times in the last 10 years, and we never changed the way we approach the problem. And part of it is the nature of the system we set up.
Uh-huh.
And so if we're not
Saoirse can
really,
help you.
so I guess I would just have some, I would like to see some consideration around that. Or we're just gonna, my prediction is we will be back in the exact same situation next year because the fundamentals haven't changed. I also am very concerned because we came up earlier based on the great language that you suggested that provoked a rich conversation around some of the things that we can't even answer because we don't have the data. And I want to make sure that if we're asking JFO and Building Bright Futures to work on this, we're being really clear about what needs to be collected. Sorry, so that JFO and Building Bright Futures can actually do that.
Yep.
Because if we wait, then it's too late. They won't be able to get the data.
Yes. Okay. Language needs work. Let's move on to the next language.
We're not gonna leave this instance of amendment yet because there's some highlighting there. And I'm just gonna point out that we have language here that requires AOE to provide any necessary data to the folks doing the report. Fifth instance of amendment is a new section to be section 21A to fit in your pre-kindergarten education reader assistance heading. Amending section 829 in Title 16, which is the pre-kindergarten education statute. In the tuition budgets and average daily membership subsection, adding a new subdivision that reads, as part of the data reporting process required pursuant to subsection 4010C of this title, A district of residence shall also report annually to the Agency of Education the number of hours of pre-kindergarten education received by each pre-K child for whom it has provided pre-K education or on whose behalf it has paid tuition pursuant to this section.
On this one too, I think it might be worth clarifying, whether the pre-K is provided as part of the Act 166 pre-K. There are also districts that pay for pre-kindergarten, through EEE. They buy additional hours because they want kids to have full day exposure. And I don't know.
Differentiating between the funding source between 166 and
I
pre-K.
think paid pursuant to this section does that.
Okay.
Great.
Why do we need to do this?
Because we have been studying the same thing for 5 years because we can't ever get answers to that
10 years.
specific question. 10 years.
I'm certain they can.
So I think that I could spend a week driving around with a clipboard and get this information, frankly, Representative Brannigan. It would be a very annoying week. I'd have to go to every school in the state with my clipboard, but I'm sure that every school in the state knows this.
I haven't been able to get it.
Such as this.
I actually don't
Okay.
know if they do, and I think it's actually more complicated. I think another piece of it is that they aren't gonna collect things they aren't required to. And then the other is that we also don't like the answers they give us, and so we keep asking again, hoping they give us a different. I just think it's complicated.
I could not do it in a week, Representative Brannigan. Maybe a summer. Maybe a summer.
I don't know. But you-
I mean, not to say like, I think that there has not been the resources that have been levied to solve the problem that are required. And I'm just using myself as an example of a resource.
I understand.
It's going to take it's a big, like, actual paperwork lift to get it answered.
But going back to that paragraph with the categorical grant issue, I was listening to what you were saying, and I was saying, yeah, and you know where I go? I go to the business manager and the special education person, and even if we went to, they need to be, I would think, at the table. I mean, they know what's going on in their schools.
And the folks in the Agency of Education can work with all of those folks in those schools to get the data, right?
But the agency that you have.
Yeah,
Building
go
right,
down until further. So
I was going back, And it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, building bright futures and joint fiscal office, that's not the people that do that for that part.
So the Building Bright Futures has a federal grant to create a data system. They can tell us more about it, but to create a data system between CDD and AOE. Because they are our statutory data something. Beth is gonna pull up the statutory data.
I'm gonna show you how I do it too.
I wouldn't really want to
Use Google.
for an agency of education, I just want the raw materials.
So they're just like a.
Global level.
Okay, so we've got 334602. Look at that.
Yeah, your secrets.
Building Bright Futures Council. It's. That's not super helpful. Sorry, in definitions. Okay, they are our regional entity to support the creation of an integrated system of early care, health, and education at the local level. This is who they're made up of. They function as a public-private partnership, with the ability to raise and disperse funds. And they advise the administration and the General Assembly on all of this. They monitor the overall system. They develop an early care, healthcare, and education system. They review and formulate recommendations for policies and rules. They work with the various secretaries on coordinating budgets and policies that affect the care, health, and education of young children. They identify and reduce duplication of services. They work with the agencies to coordinate, et cetera. So they have quite an extensive charge. So we just looked at this language regarding collecting data related to hours. We're in the same statute. We're in the rule subsection. This is the pre-K statute. And AOE and DCF jointly have developed rules that do a whole bunch of things. And by the time we get to subdivision 10, which is to establish a system by the agency and Department of Children and Families to jointly monitor and evaluate pre-K education programs, we're adding Building Bright Futures to this requirement.
Carly, you good? Okay,
You think they'll talk to the building, the budget people in the schools?
who?
Building Bright Futures or AOE or anybody?
Yes, that's the Agency of Education's
All
job.
right. So.
Representative Holcomb.
I just think, I think at some point there, I think it's worth considering complexity as a cost in and of itself. And you see it in just 3 places, just on this one little page. First of all, when people have co-responsibility and they don't agree, nothing happens. And that happens repeatedly in this sector. And part of it's because they have 2 sets of federal statute and 2 sets of federal rules, 2 sets of state statute and 2 sets of state rules that often disagree. So it becomes quite ossified. And with Building Bright Futures, we've taken a 2-headed hydra and added a 3rd head. And now they're going to have to all 3 negotiate how to make this sector work. And the entire reason we're doing this is because we're trying to use education funds off the property tax to fund childcare. And that's a choice, but I do think it's in our interest to try to do this in the most streamlined and efficient way possible. Because sometimes dual administration or triple administration, I don't know what the word is, it can become very cumbersome. And it's also a little interesting to have non-education, given the Hoyt bill and all the rules around use of property taxes for education, it's interesting to have a non-education entity directing use of education funding. So it's just an interesting thing I'll put out on the table, since it shows up in people's school budgets locally.
What is the non-education part?
Well, I just think if you're gonna have,
Building Bright Futures?
yeah, it's a public-private partnership and Department of Children and Families making decisions that are $6,000 being, shared responsibility. I just think it's worth considering.
Yes, Representative.
Read something from my school district
I,
person.
sure, you don't have to get my permission for that, I'm not the speaker.
All right. This looks concerning to me because it seems to envision this 10 hours in the A1 paragraph. Only 10 hours of service. That's the current model for providing financial assistance to private preschool providers, universal pre-K. However, the 10 hours being subsidized by the state is far fewer hours than some school districts provide, and perhaps fewer than most school districts provide when serving preschool students in their buildings. So if this 10-hour subsidy was intended to replace current weights, then public schools will receive far less money to serve these students, so much so that it may no longer make sense for a public preschool to operate a program, which would severely reduce the availability of preschool. And then the second point, fixing the same amount, does it say that here? For private and public, but the public has to meet higher standards. That's an issue. So those are some issues.
Those are some issues, yeah.
And do you think that this paragraph,
I think there's if the state's gonna pay for the districts that are offering 40 hours a week of pre-K, then we need to guarantee that all districts in the state are subsidized to pay for 40 hours of pre-K. And that is a significant expansion of education fund costs. If that is what we're interested in doing, that's a separate conversation. There's also the question of, should all of it be covered by the Child Development Division? This body decided not to, that 10 hours a week is covered out of the Ed Fund as pre-K. to my understanding, districts that are right now offering more than 10 hours, some of those districts are covering that by billing CFEFAP and are in fact sometimes covering the costs in a way that's quite innovative. That is also something that we don't have enough details on and we need to study. What my goal, and it's a narrow goal, is to say the weights that we have in current law do not work and will work even right now under current law and will be even worse under the foundation formula. And right now we have districts making very district maximizing decisions based on current law that could put us in a real bind in a couple of years if it continues this way. So I hear that everyone doesn't like this language. No agency, the Education Committee and the Human Services Committee also could not come into agreement in the language. And so we'll go back to the drawing board about language.
I just have to register a protest because the language we use to talk about school districts' decisions is pretty negative, and they're not just trying to self-optimize. They are dealing with the reality of a voucher system. And if you live in a rural district, that plays very differently than if you're in an urban district. So I've never heard a superintendent say, we're not trying to provide access to high quality pre-kindergarten, but it's a very different proposition when you have a mandatory voucher program and you live in different parts of the state. And so people.
I don't think that maximizing the opportunities to your district is a negative way to describe anything. I think it is actually like you're maximizing the needs of the students in your district.
But you get your hands tied and your foot tied to a ball because they can't manage resources in a cost-effective way.
Okay, so I'm gonna put this language away and we're gonna move on to the next section. If you two want to work together before tomorrow to come up with a couple of paragraphs for this that the two other committees can also agree with, we can look at it tomorrow.
I'm on page 9 of this document and the 6th instance of amendment, and this is going to be the main, basically everything Kirby went over today and everything that's new that we're done amending education's work and now we're adding sections that are brand new. So we've got this green highlighting here to represent, we don't know how many sections we're adding yet, so we're just going to leave those blank. So the first new section, where as a new reader assistance heading here for data collection. We're adding a new section, section 22, and we're amending 16 VSA 4010 subsection C, which is part of your, which is in the education funding chapter. This is where all your weights live. It's also where the requirement that each school district report student data for each of the weighting categories lives. In current law, so right here, each school district shall annually report to AOE by a date established by the agency the information needed in order for the agency to compute the weighting categories. We're adding on page 10, clarification that it's for all resident students in grades pre-K through 12. In order to fulfill this obligation, a school district that pays public tuition on behalf of a resident student to a public school in another school district, an approved independent school, an out-of-state school, we're adding, or a pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten education provider. Current law just says the school district may request that the receiving school collect some of the demographic information related to weighting categories. And if it's requested, then the receiving school has to provide that information in a timely manner. We're striking all that language and we're saying, for all your tuition students, each school district shall require each resident student in pre-K through grade 12 on whose behalf the district pays tuition to complete a form or forms developed by the school district in order to obtain the information needed in order for the agency to compute the weighting categories under subsection B of this section for all students residing in that district, including students that are educated by a receiving school.
Beth, did you mean for developed by the school district, form or forms developed by the school district and not by the state?
I mean, whatever you tell me to mean.
Okay. I'm just thinking
The
about,
former form should be developed by the state. Thank you. And I think have been developed by the state.
For all weighting categories?
Well, maybe not all weighting categories. Thank you, Beth. I'm so glad that you have details as a major force in your brain.
So that made, so again, I don't work in the field. This may be an area where you need extra language development requirements.
This would be another great area for our rule-making list too.
Do you want that to be in rule or form?
Form. Form. And there was something in the language of when the income form was created about like a need to consult with people who know things about such things.
The universal income declaration form, 27. Okay, I'll take a look at that. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, I should, but I don't know why this isn't being done already.
Yeah, me either.
I'm kind of floored that it's fell out.
I will confess that I feel personally like, when we passed 127, we, used some maize when we should have used some shells, and I want to take some responsibility for that. We used some maize when we should have used some shells, and I want to take responsibility for that.
We all worked on it together.
I know. I said some responsibility, not all the responsibility.
Worked hard on that.
I mean, Teddy should take some responsibility too, really.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
I was on the other side of the table.
Yeah, exactly. Representative Holcomb.
I think part of this, the rules changed and figuring out ways for a tax capacity system is very different. So they probably didn't have the need that we have a need for higher level. Because you can use the direct cert to figure out the proportion and apply that to
So you
different
actually-
ways. So my guess is, I mean, part of the problem is when we went to universal meals, it became difficult to collect the forms from some kids. And so then they started using direct cert. And once you do direct cert, it's a proportion, and that can be your weight, I assume, for.
So my understanding is that we can't use direct cert in a number of locations, that didn't follow within this, and so. And direct cert had not happened yet when we passed the universal minimum form, so there is some.
Well, you can't use it if you're not doing universal meals. Yes. But the other thing is, I mean, something to think about. The federal guidelines are changing too. And we may want to have, I know Julie had mentioned SLIFE that we need to get students who are learning English. We need to get good data on that. We can use data, but it's also clear that some of the federal categories may shift as well. So we may need to.
And we do have
Flexibility.
So we can check that language. My memory of the language in 127 is it's actually quite comprehensive. So that if direct cert went away, we would actually have backup systems for it, but we can look at that again. Because clearly there were things about that were far from perfect at the time. So exciting that we're doing this. Should have done it sooner. Glad we're doing it now. Yes? Other thoughts? Great. Oh, we're switching topics.
New reader assistance heading, special education funding. I believe you all have looked at this language before, but just not with me. And so the only changes to this intent language regarding maintenance of effort and special education funding is highlighted in yellow. So if it's not highlighted and you've already looked at this language, that the language that's not highlighted hasn't changed.
And the Special Education Association sent an email after thoroughly looking at it and said, yay, thank you so much. I don't remember if I forwarded that email. I will find it and forward it if I did not. Did I forward it? Great. No, I will take that as a no. I will forward the email.
So it is the intent of the General Assembly to ensure that Vermont complies with federal maintenance of effort requirements and any education funding reform. It is the intent of the General Assembly that the state shall maintain an education funding structure in which special education is funded through a supplemental reimbursement, weighted student count or grant model that reflects eligible special education costs. And it is the intent of the General Assembly that implementation of Act 73 or any future education funding reform shall not limit the right of students with disabilities. I believe that's it for changes to this language. Another brand new reader assistance heading.
Can you do slow down 1 second? Right. Seeing no objections, I am informally finalizing that language.
So
special education is funded supplemental reimbursement, weighted student count or grant model that reflects eligible special education costs. So it'll be decided later how that. And who'll decide that when?
So JFO study and AOE is doing some work too, and we have to decide it next year.
Federal law require, I mean, the literal definition of FAPE is free and appropriate public education, which in Vermont is defined by the education quality standards. I don't know how a school district can ensure FAPE or access to FAPE in a school that does not meet education quality standards. So I wonder if this needs to apply, if all students that are publicly funded need to conform to the Vermont education quality standards.
Another question for Beth.
I personally think, well, no, this is a policy decision. I think it makes sense to require them to meet the same standards, or we can't ensure that they're going to be paid. And it affects where districts.
I'm sorry, all independent schools would have to meet the education quality standards as part of this paragraph that was approved by the Special Education Association.
They were asked about, they were focused on a different issue.
Yes.
Before we leave this section.
That's a huge policy decision that is very much outside of the jurisdiction of this committee.
I don't think it's a real problem, particularly when you're talking about a
That's
foundation.
fine for you to tell me, but we're
I
trying
said
to
it
do this.
repeatedly to the education committee. I think, but it also relates to the funding format, because if you are not holding people to the same standards, they should not be receiving the same tuition.
That's
Is that in our jurisdiction? I'm not being.
I don't know. I need to take a break. That's what I'm doing now. I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee.
All right, good. Yeah. 'Cause I'm
10 minutes.
I'm a hard time. Yeah.